Hi, and welcome to the second module of this Pluralsight course titled Practical HTML5. My name is Gilles Cleren and you can contact me via Twitter via @GillesCleren. In the first module of this course, we have created, using the new HTML5 tags, a very basic site with some simple pages in there. In this second module, we will improve the visuals of the site skeleton using CSS3, and we will also include some very simple JavaScript already to make the site, well, let's say, a bit more interactive. The agenda for this module is pretty much what I've just mentioned. We will start by taking a short overview of CSS. Note that we'll have a full module on the new things in CSS3 later in this course. Next, again as a short introduction, we'll see how we can make our pages more interactive using JavaScript. The first target of this module, therefore, is understanding what CSS is and what it can do for our site. Understanding how to include some very simple JavaScript to make the site more interactive is target number 2. So far, the pages that we have created in the first module aren't looking very good yet. We can really use some styling help here. In the first part of this second module, we will look at some basic CSS which we need at this point in the demo to make sure that we have a reasonable layout for our pages. In a later module, we'll learn what is new in CSS3, which is part of HTML5. I'm going to assume that you are familiar with the concept and advantages of CSS. CSS, or cascading style sheets, allow us to group layout code in a central location, instead of cluttering our regular markup code with all these extra attributes. An added advantage is that we can easily make changes in one location, and all pages using the styles defined in CSS will be updated. Talking about styling in general, styling information can be added to HTML in 3 ways. The first one is basically inline. We then use the style attribute on the HTML element directly. In the style value, we can use CSS in the form of key value pairs. In the sample here, we are changing the color of this paragraph to blue using an inline style. I think it's pretty obvious that this type of styling isn't really recommended, since we aren't placing all of our style information in that central location. We're completely missing out on the reuse part of things. The second option is grouping our style information in the style block in the head of the page. While we are grouping the styles now, which is good, we still can't reuse our styles over several pages. The best option to work with CSS is using the link element. Using the link element, we can reference a CSS file in our page, as can be seen in the third sample that just popped up on the slide. Of course, more than one CSS file can be linked to the page using this approach. And since our styles are now defined in separate files, we can reuse these styles over several pages. Before we'll add styles to the pages we already created in the previous module, I want to make sure you're on board with the basic rules of the CSS game. CSS itself is composed out of rules. A rule is in itself a combination of a selector and one or more style declarations. A selector is used to indicate which HTML elements are the target of the style declaration. We'll look at possible selector types in the next slides. After the selector, we can indicate what the style should look like using several style indications, and each declaration is basically a key value pair in the form of property, colon, and then the value. Each declaration must end with a semicolon. Since we often end up with a large number of declarations, shorthand is often used. As you can see in the sample here, instead of creating a separate declaration for all properties we want to use, we can wrap them in a shorthand version. Let's break down a CSS rule and let's look in some more detail at the CSS selectors. As mentioned, CSS selectors are used to select one or more elements on the HTML page, and on these elements the CSS rules will then be applied. We can make selections based on the tag name. In this case, all paragraphs on the page will be selected and their content will be set to green. We can also use the class name. In this case, we need to prefix the class name with a dot. And if you want to be even more specific, we can use the ID of an element. And in this case, we have to prefix with a hash sign. Selectors aren't limited to using just one single selection option. We can combine them. For example, in this selector here, we're saying that we want to retrieve all elements with the class coffee type applied on them, which are within a paragraph. Basically, this is a logical AND operator which is applied on the elements. In this case, we do not have to specify a space between the two selectors. If we want to be more specific again, we can use child and descendant selectors. An example of a descendant selector is shown on the slide here in the form of coffee type, space, and then the anchor tag. This selector will retrieve anchor tags which are a descendant of an element with the class coffee type. If we add a greater than symbol, then we are creating a child selector. In this case, the anchor tag should be a direct child of the element with the class coffee type applied on it. Otherwise, it won't get selected with this selector. Next to the, let's say, regular selectors, there are also pseudo classes and pseudo elements. We'll see a lot more on these in a later module. For now, take a look at the samples here on the slide. Pseudo classes and elements allow us to make selections which would be quite hard, if not impossible, to make otherwise. The first child and the first letter are some examples here. But don't worry, we'll take a look at these in much more detail later in the course. With the selection made, we can then apply a style declaration. It's impossible, and I think it's also quite useless, to look at all styles that we can set. So a small sample should give you an idea here on how they work. Very often, styles are applied on colors. For example, we can specify that all H1 headers should have a specific color. Backgrounds are also typically controlled using CSS. Backgrounds have quite a few color properties, such as color, image, position, and many more. We can specify them all separately, but we can also choose to use a shorthand version, which is the last code sample you see here on the slide. Also, text properties are often styled using CSS. Style information like the font size and the font weight can be controlled quite easily. Also, things like underlining of text can be done with CSS, and you see a sample of that here on the slide. CSS is of course used for styling individual elements, but it is also used to create layout for our pages. Before we start talking about layout, a little warning is in place. When creating a page layout, do not resort to using tables. It's bound to get you in trouble. It will be very hard to create a layout which scales well on different browsers, certainly on mobile devices. Another reason for not using tables is that a table will only be rendered after the closing tag is encountered, which is of course not a good thing for the layout of your page. If we can't use tables, what should we use then? So far in HTML, we've had a div element for layout purposes. Now in combination with CSS, this offers us all the firepower we needed to build a great looking layout. Since HTML5, however, we have the ability to also use the new semantic elements such as the article and the section. And they should be used wherever they can to add semantic meaning to the content. For the layout of individual elements, CSS uses the CSS box model. This model essentially says that each element has a number of layers around it. These layers allow us to create a border around the element and allows us to define spacing between elements. The actual content is right in the middle, and it specifies a size using a width and a height. Quite often, we don't use the absolute values, instead we use upper and lower bounds. The first layer we encounter then is the padding. Padding clears an area around the content. The next layer is the border, which goes around the padding and of course also around the content. And the last layer is the margin, which clears an area around the border. When creating page layouts, we have to resort to some other CSS properties as well. CSS has display properties, which specify how an element is going to be positioned in the layout of the page. There are two possible options here, inline and block. Now, some elements are inlines and some are blocks by default, and it's possible using CSS to override this behavior. Inline elements are positioned next to each other, so basically on the same line. Typical inline elements include the span, the image, the anchor, and quite a few more. Block elements don't want to be positioned on the same line by default, so what they do is taking up all the horizontal space. Any following content will be directed to a new line beneath the block element. The default block element is of course the div, but also paragraphs, headers, articles, sections, and many more are block elements by default. To see how they behave, let's take a look at this drawing. The inline elements will place themselves next to each other until they have reached the width of their container. Whenever we create multiple block elements, each containing inlines, the block elements will position themselves below each other. Each will start a new line. The last thing I want to show you before we go and apply all this in the demo is the float. Looking at the HTML spec, a float is actually a box which is shifted to the left or right on the current line, and other content may flow along the side of the float. When using float, for example, on a div, the element is laid out first according to the normal flow like we've just seen in the previous slides. Then it's actually taken out of the normal flow and shifted to the right or to the left. This allows us, for example, to create text which flows around an image, which wouldn't otherwise be possible to do. Floats are very commonly used to create a column-based layout, which is why we'll use it too. Next to float, we can also use the clear. When we want to make sure that an element that follows a floating element sits below the floats, we can use the clear property. When using the clear value, we make sure that the element won't have others on its left or right side. Let me show you this in a small example. The layout we see here is a pretty typical web page layout with a header, main content, a sidebar, and a footer. To create this layout, we add a block element for the header, which will use all possible space horizontally. Next, we want the main content block to remain on the left. A block element by default doesn't allow this, so we'll use a float here. The element is set with float left, meaning it's going to go to the far left side of the page. The sidebar, again a block element, now needs to go to the right of the content, which will work since we have marked it as being a float also. We again specify float left so that it will position itself next to the main content. Finally, we have a footer. The footer shouldn't use float, but instead we want it to take all available space on a new line. For this we use the clear and specify the value to be both. This ensures that the footer element shouldn't receive any neighboring elements on either of its sides. Let us now go back to the demo, and we'll add CSS code to create the layout, and we'll also add some more HTML5 elements.